an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. On our last show, we spoke to Dr. Jeffrey Mogul about preclinical research and how it relates to clinical research and the benefits for chronic pain treatment. Lots of great information, so if you missed this episode, you can listen to it on our Spotify and Apple feed, and subscribe to the show so you keep getting the updates of new episodes that are coming out. So many who suffer from chronic pain also can have inflammation, which can impact quality of life. But what is inflammation, and what are the ways to help reduce inflammation in the body? Today I'm joined by Dr. Alexandra Perel-Winkler, who specializes in complex chronic diseases. Alexandra, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tom. So nice to be here. Great
to have you on the show. So I know we talked a little bit about this offline, and I've been doing a bit of reading on inflammation, but for our audience, maybe you can just start by what is inflammation and how does it impact us?
I think that inflammation is this word these days. It's like this buzzword that people can use. So I think it's really good to do this little definition because inflammation is a natural process that occurs in the body. And the reason that we have this process is at its baseline, it's defense and repair. So when we need to defend or repair ourselves from injury or infection, that's when our body, our immune system mounts a reaction, which we call inflammation. So it's a complex cascade of processes that involve lots of different chemical messengers and signaling molecules and lots of different cells. But we can think about it really simply that if we have a cut, I have a little scratch right now that I got on my wrist. When I look at it, it might have discoloration. There's some red around it. There's some maybe yellow that's causing and helping the repair of the skin coming back together. So that all is inflammation. So at its most basic, we know inflammation is happening. If we see an area of our body that's red, hot, painful, and swollen, these are signs that that process is happening. And so inflammation in and of itself is really useful for us because we need it for this defense and repair. However, why inflammation is getting a bad rep in our sort of modern culture is because when inflammatory processes become persistent, what happens is what I call an evolutionary mismatch, where we have this mismatch between what we want to be a self-limiting process and we have this process be persistent. And that's when we sometimes see problems and contribution to chronic disease and pain.
So what I understand you're saying is it is normal to have this. It's part of the healing process. Is that correct?
Yes.
But maybe, or what's changed nowadays, one, I guess, of course, is social media and everything. It's become a buzzword, like you said, and probably a misunderstanding of what it really is and how it helps us. But are you also saying that environmental or lifestyle has impacted how inflammation is supposed to help us? Am I hearing that correctly? Or?
Exactly. So there's a reason why it is a buzzword, and I'm not saying, the health influencers are wrong. I think that it is great that there's this awareness that chronic inflammation can really contribute to disease. And at the same time, inflammation in and of itself isn't bad. It's sort of a neutral. It's a process that happens in our body. As you said, it's part of the healing process when we have injury or when we have infection. But we don't want this process to be persistent or chronic. And definitely, I want to get into the lifestyle factors because that's huge.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that too, because as you alluded to, the health influencers that are out there, of course, that's what they're talking about a lot. But there's so much information out there. What is correct and what isn't, and we'll get into that. So when you talk about inflammation, I've heard inflammation. For example, inflammation can impact when it comes to diabetes, or stress can increase inflammation, which can lead to chronic disease. Could you maybe touch on those a bit?
I think about different things that can cause inflammation. So I talked about injury and infection. So that's kind of why inflammation is in our body. It's to protect us and repair us from those things. But then we have to think about the environment and what's in our environment and what we're exposed to. We have to think about our lifestyle and what we're putting in our bodies and how we're acting. So you mentioned stress, for example. If you're leading a high stress lifestyle, stress is not just an experience in our cognition or in our psycho-emotional life, but stress is also a physiologic experience, right? We have an increased sympathetic activation, which I'm sure you've talked about before on this podcast. We have a hormonal response, which elevates different hormones and neurotransmitters. And so there's changes that are happening in the body from the nervous and hormonal perspectives that impact our immune system. And that will lead to the change in our immune system to mount an inflammatory response. So the inflammatory response is sort of a response that happens whenever there's a stress. And other things that are lesser known, but you mentioned diabetes, so I'm happy you did because I think this is so important. Elevated sugar in our body and high glucose spikes and high insulin spikes, but not just necessarily the spikes, but just a chronic elevation of high levels of sugar in our bloodstream can lead to more inflammation. So we see that there's this sort of overlap between prediabetes and diabetes and higher levels of inflammation as well. So, we can have inflammation because we have a condition that's inflammatory. For example, rheumatoid arthritis, is an inflammatory condition because it's an autoimmune condition. It has an inflammatory nature built into it. Or we can have inflammation secondarily because we have elevated sugars or high levels of stress or poor lifestyles, like we're not sleeping enough. We are maybe smoking or engaging in other inflammatory behaviors. And also, unfortunately, we are now bathed in different molecules and chemicals in our environment that we now know. This isn't really a fringe thing anymore. Lots of people are talking about the exposure that we have to plastics in our water and in our food, which is really pervasive. We have forever chemicals in our environment that, were pumped into the world in the 1970s, those sorts of things. So as I said before, I like to think of it as evolutionary mismatch. We have evolved to have processes like inflammation in our system, and then our body is also able to turn down that inflammation. But when we're constantly being surrounded by chemicals in the environment and our phone is beeping and we have blue light in the evening and that's all causing stress on our systems, the way that we live our days these days, we kind of live in an inflammatory world. And so we need to really think about that and work on doing what we can to shift into a more anti-inflammatory lifestyle.
Yeah, and I want to dive deeper into that because the PFAS and the plastics. I mean, I've been doing reading on that too, and it's kind of scary. It almost a bit of, well, maybe I'm taking it as doom and gloom, but I think other people are looking at it saying, well, if a person's eating properly and exercising and still surrounded by, the clothing we wear, things we sit in, and even the food is contaminated with it, well, at what point do you just say, how do I move forward with all this? So I'd like to dive deeper into that one. But so when we talk about inflammation and stress, so is it possible that somebody who does everything right, is eating properly, exercising and that, but lives a very high stress life, that they could be open to chronic disease then because of the inflammation?
Absolutely. I mean, I think about sort of that like archetype of the type A CEO who, dies of a massive heart attack in their 50s or 60s at their desk, There's different people where it affects differently, but we used to think, back in the day, fat was bad. That was like the 1990s, fat is terrible. Now we understand that atherosclerosis is so much more about inflammation. Heart disease is so much more about inflammation. Yeah. Yes, there's certain types of molecules within the fat particles that could predispose you to higher risk, but ultimately it's the inflammation that makes these fat particles stick to your vessels. So we're talking about, inflammation and stress lead to a huge array of changes in the body, which could, stress in and of itself, as another example, when we're stressed, we have that mobilized physical response that I mentioned. And again, we've evolved that a stress is a life threat. When we have a stress response in our system, we think, our body thinks life threat. And therefore, one of the ways that our body adapts is to raise the sugar in our body because we want to be able to run away from the cheetah, right? We want to fight or flight. And so we need sugar to go into our muscles. And therefore, we're raising our blood sugar in our bloodstream. But if we're actually just stressed out because we're sitting at a computer working through emails and we're in a rush and there's traffic and all the other things of our modern life, then we're actually not moving that blood sugar that's raised into our muscle. It's just hanging out in our bloodstream. And then that's predisposing us for prediabetes, diabetes, atherosclerosis, brain, disease, Alzheimer's, dementia. Not to be doomsday here, but this is the truth.
Well, there's always hope. That's why we're doing this podcast. So we got to, I think, provide that education. And it's interesting because I'm sure we could do just a whole episode on the whole cholesterol and inflammation discussion that's out there. Because I know, someone who's had not high numbers, but borderline high numbers, LDL numbers, and did a calcium score test, and their arteries are clear, right? So why, yet they're being told that, well, you got to watch your diet, you got to watch this, you got to watch that. But, so I'm sure that could be a show on its own. But when we talk about the inflammation and the sugar, and you kind of touched on a little bit about diabetes, but maybe you can expand on that too. We know that food, of course, processed food and exercise and that, of course, if a person's not doing that, could lead to diabetes. But how does the inflammation, maybe you can talk on the medical side, how the inflammation and diabetes, those two are connected?
Well, with that, it's actually that the raise, it's basically an interaction between seeing the high levels of glucose in the bloodstream and the body, how that signals to the immune system to mount an inflammatory response. So, I could go into like the cascade details of how these two interactions occur, but I think it would be like not necessary. But it's basically that all of our systems in our body communicate. So our body sees this elevation in the glucose chronically as a danger. The same way that it would see, there's something to defend, there's something to repair here, there's something going on, and I need to mount a response. And so the inflammatory response happens.
Okay. And then that just over time, I guess, just leads to diabetes and over time, right?
So no, that's not leading to diabetes. So it's a little bit different with the stress leads to inflammation. The diabetes itself is just the raised glucose over time, but it's layered in with the inflammation being another risk factor for disease. So it sort of like interacts and makes your vessels unhealthy and, is bad for your nerves. And, it's just sort of like a toxic thing to have coursing through your body constantly.
And so what about the connection with inflammation and chronic pain?
Yeah. So, inflammation in itself, pain can be part of it when you have an injury, right? So I think that's probably an evolutionary way to say, oh, okay, don't like bash your injured hand on the door handle. But what happens when there's a lot of inflammation in the body, that the molecules, these signaling molecules, communicate with the nerves of our body. So it can perpetuate and augment, attenuate the nervous system experience and reaction to the pain. And then there's a little bit of a difference here. So that's if your body's bathed in inflammation already, you might have increased experience of pain or it might augment the nervous system to put you at higher risk for developing nociceptive pain or complex central sensitized pain. And then there's also an inflammatory process that occurs when you do have nociceptive pain happening. So I think you guys have probably talked about nociceptive pain on the podcast. And central sensitization has a lot to do with just changes in the nervous system and in the tracts of the nerves, sending different types of communication. But there's also the process of inflammation happening on the level of the immune system in the central nervous system, which is something that can be really helpful to focus on when you are working with central sensitized pain.
Okay. So let's get into what are some things that can help reduce inflammation?
Yeah. So, I think that we've touched on some of these things. A lot of it is around lifestyle. So we can talk in a minute about, some supplements I like and a medication that I want to bring up, but definitely, when we're thinking about lifestyle, if we can work on stress reduction, if we can make sure that if it's appropriate for you, if you're moving your body, if you are sleeping, sleep is huge, right? Sleep is our massive recovery, and this can be challenging with pain, but doing what you can to get as good sleep as you can. Working on diet. So diet, there's like is a huge category here. Working on your sugar. So you don't necessarily need to have, a low sugar diet, but definitely I recommend low processed carbohydrates, low, syrups. And then there's also some great hacks that you can do to just optimize keeping your sugar down and not having massive spikes. So the biggest thing is eating fiber. Also eating like more simple carbs, like your pasta and your bread, layering it with fats and proteins. So, that's why we eat peanut butter on our toast, or why we have a sandwich instead of just eating bread alone. Eating fiber first before you have the carbohydrates. So the way that you order your foods can make a huge difference. Also, we see this sort of in so many different cultures. We often eat a salad first, and then some sort of like vegetable appetizer before you go on to the main meal. So all of these things can actually make huge impact to decreasing your sugar levels after you have your food as well. And then choosing to have a more anti-inflammatory diet overall. So fiber is like so huge for this, eating lots of vegetables and lots of fruits, and having lots of different colors in your diet so that you're getting lots of different minerals and nutrients and vitamins that your body needs for the processes that it does. Because again, inflammation is going to come up if there's a problem in the body. So if your body has the vitamins and nutrients it needs, it's going to work better. Having healthy fats. So again, this is just an essential nutrient that we need in our life. And so when our body needs something, it can be under stress. Stress leads to inflammation. So give yourself some healthy fats, and definitely getting enough protein. So that's sort of like my overall how I approach diet. I don't think it needs to be so complicated. This is what I've said is pretty much the Mediterranean diet, and it's often called the anti-inflammatory diet in the literature. There's tons of diets out there, but I think that for most people overall, unless you have very specific conditions that you're working on with a provider, I think following this sort of anti-inflammatory guideline is really helpful. And then I really like working on reducing my toxic burden. So, as we said, there's forever chemicals in the world that we can't do anything about, but we do have choice with some things. So, I personally choose to have glass Tupperware instead of plastic Tupperware. I don't warm anything up for my family in plastic. We don't have plastic water bottles. We definitely don't use plastic water bottles. I'm moving out of my plastic athleisure into, organic cotton stretchy pants sort of thing. So making these choices slowly, you don't have to go into your pantry and say, okay, I'm going to remove all of my, chemical cleaning products right now, or I'm going to remove all of my personal hygiene products. But when you are replacing something, you could think, oh, could I choose something that could decrease my toxic burden right now? And the cool thing about household cleaning products is that what I've found is pretty much everything can be cleaned with white vinegar and water. You can add some essential oils. There's a ton that you can DIY. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is super costly. And there's so much now, I've been into this for like 20 years, and 20 years ago, there was like no clean makeup, but now it's so prevalent. Sephora makes their own, their bottom line, their own brand is supposedly clean. So, there's probably variants of that, but you can definitely find so many different options at different price points. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Obviously, I always sometimes skip don't smoke, because I think it's so prevalently, people are so aware of that now. But obviously, if you are smoking, that is a highly inflammatory activity.
Same with alcohol and all those other things too.
Alcohol too. Yeah.
If we look at health food or even, eating healthy, but even things like canned fish or any canned product has some kind of a lining still in it. It's still BPA free apparently, but it still has, like, we don't know exactly what's in everything, right? So it's so hard.
Yeah, we've
try to
switched
eat
to
healthy,
silicone.
right?
We've switched everything to silicone, but now with silicone, we're going to find out that that's bad too. It's challenging.
It's still a chemical at the end of the day, right? Which makes it hard. But even like, I guess the pre and probiotics too for good, gut health. I think gut health now is kind of on the radar. A lot of documentaries out on it, programs out on it. But I guess that also helps towards inflammation or reducing inflammation.
Yeah, hugely. And that's we don't have a lot of time, but gut health is huge. And
no, we don't.
The gut is a huge place in the body that protects from inflammation. But when the gut is unhealthy, it also could be an exacerbant. So definitely having good gut health. But again, when we go back to what I just discussed, if you're eating all that fiber, it's going to be prebiotic for supporting that microbiome. It's going to be supportive for the mucosal lining. Also, all those toxins are toxic, especially I didn't want to get into like the organic and grass-fed, but if you're eating pesticides, food that's, sprayed with pesticide, we have microbiota in our gut, right? So that also hugely affects the gut.
Yeah, especially with the sludging that they were doing on the fields, which are still continuing in Canada. So for our audience who doesn't know what that is, that's using the sludge from sewage waste that's being put on the fields, and it's been done for I think over 30 years or something like that. And they have the PFAS in there. So it gets into our food either way. So you're saying as long as you have a good gut health, that could help mitigate some of those chemicals that are just in our environment that are hard to get rid of.
Well, it protects our mucosal lining to prevent those chemicals from seeping in from what you're eating into our internal system. Yeah.
So in kind of boiling it down, it's fiber, good fats, protein, stay away from sugar if you can.
You can. You can stay away from sugar.
You can.
And, I gave some of those tips. I wanted to say just before we kind of wrap up also that for people who need support when they have a high inflammatory burden already, I also really, really love turmeric supplements. Obviously with any supplement recommendations that I'm giving here, you should talk to your provider, but curcumin is a super well-researched, super powerful molecule that's incredibly anti-inflammatory. It has so much research that it's good for your brain. It's good for your blood sugar levels. It's good for cardiovascular disease. It's good for your gut health. And it can be really helpful for pain. So curcumin is one thing that I would really put on people's radar. Omega-3s, healthy again for so many reasons, super anti-inflammatory, would be one of those supplements I'd consider. And a lot of people here will know about low-dose naltrexone, which is also obviously a pharmaceutical, but one of my favorites. So when I was thinking and preparing to come here, I was like, what are, my top 3 anti-inflammatory supplements or things that you can take? And those would be the top 3 that I would explore with your provider if you are interested in going a little further. If you have a lot of inflammation already, sometimes you need a little help to dial it down.
And what was the last one, the pharmaceutical?
The low-dose naltrexone.
Okay.
Have you guys talked about that?
No, we haven't. There's so much to talk about. We have so much to talk about on this show. I know. We're going to have to have you back.
I'm going to demand to come back to talk about low-dose naltrexone.
Well, we can do that, and maybe we can talk about gut health. We can talk about PFAS and other forever chemicals and supplements. I know on social media and on the net, they're talking about, supplements to help reduce PFASs in the liver. And I don't know how much of this is true and how much has been really researched. So that would be, I think, an interesting topic from an evidence-based point of view versus just an opinion-based point of view. There's more we can talk about, Alexandra. A lot more.
I'm an educator, so I actually spend hours talking about all of this stuff all the time. So yeah, it's hard to bring it into 30 minutes, but I would be so happy to come back, and I hope that this was helpful.
I found it very helpful, and I hope you were able to get out, be able to talk about what you had wanted on the time we had.
Absolutely.
I thought everything was great, so I appreciate you being on the show.
My absolute pleasure.
And for feedback about the show or more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca. Follow us on Facebook and X at Chronic Pain COE and on Instagram at Chronic Pain _COE. Stay safe, everybody, and keep the hope alive.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network.